The night was quiet in Doha. Families were sleeping, children tucked into their beds, the city at peace. Then, at exactly 3:47 in the morning, the silence broke. The roar of Israeli F-35 jets thundered across the sky. Precision missiles tore into a communications hub in the capital. Windows shattered. Mothers clutched their children as fire and smoke lit up the horizon. In one moment, the city went from calm to chaos. Israel called it counterterrorism. Officials said it was a preemptive strike. But to ordinary people, it was something far simpler. Their sovereign land had been attacked without warning. In the middle of the night, their homes were shaken awake by a power far stronger than them. And yet, the shockwaves of that strike did not stop in Doha. They traveled far, more than 2,000 miles away, to the heart of Africa. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, radios crackled with the headline, "Israel strikes Qatar." For many Africans, it was not just about Qatar. It was about their own homes, their own past, their own fear that tomorrow it could be them. That morning, one man decided silence was no longer an option. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely in his 30s, the leader of Burkina Faso, picked up the phone and called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directly. His words were calm but firm. "Your aircraft crossed a line. Africa will not stay silent." It was not a threat shouted in anger. It was a declaration, and with it, a chain reaction began. In that moment, the world saw something unexpected. Africa, long dismissed as a bystander in global affairs, was beginning to speak in a single voice. And the question for all of us, whether you sit today in Chicago, in Dallas, or in Miami, is this. If powerful nations can strike without warning in the Gulf, what would stop them from pulling America into another endless war tomorrow? Before I go further, think about this. Do you believe silence protects sovereignty, or does it destroy it? In the hours after the strike, confusion filled the airwaves. Qatar condemned the attack, Israel defended it, and Western news anchors treated it like another distant conflict in the Middle East. But in Africa, the story landed differently. In Ouagadougou, dawn had barely broken when the old miner Adama, 67 years old, turned up the volume on his battered radio. He had worked the gold pits north of the city his entire life. His hands were calloused, his lungs weakened by dust. As the announcer's voice crackled through the static, Adama whispered to his wife, "They test Qatar today. Tomorrow they test us." That single thought captured the mood across a continent. For generations, Africa had been the backdrop of wars it never started. Airstrikes called counterterrorism. Coups justified as stabilization. Resource grabs disguised as partnerships. Every bomb that fell on Doha echoed decades of humiliation Africans knew too well. By mid-morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on national television. Wearing military fatigues, eyes steady, he did not wait for Europe or Washington to set the tone. He looked into the camera and said, "No nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence." His statement was short, but its power shook more than one capital. Within hours, leaders across the Sahel began making calls. Mali's president, Assimi Goïta, signaled support. Niger's General Abdourahmane Chiani echoed the sentiment. Guinea's Mamadi Doumbouya declared that sovereignty was sacred. For the first time in years, African leaders were not whispering. They were roaring. Tel Aviv miscalculated. Israeli officials dismissed Burkina Faso as a poor, landlocked country with little leverage. They expected Traoré's words to be swallowed up by silence. Instead, a wave began to build. By the 6th hour, African presidents were coordinating statements. By the 12th hour, Netanyahu's office was scrambling to reach the African Union. And by the 24th hour, Israeli defense contractors were in panic, fearing billions of dollars in losses from canceled deals. The reaction spread beyond politics. In Accra, Ghana's parliament erupted in debate, with members demanding suspension of Israeli contracts. In Abuja, Nigeria's president refused to take Netanyahu's call. In Bamako, young men painted slogans on city walls. Africa bows to no one. In Johannesburg, pensioners called late-night radio shows, recalling apartheid and declaring that silence must never again define Africa's place in the world. But the image that spread fastest was not from Africa. It was from an airport security checkpoint. Cameras captured Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, standing awkwardly in line after African officials refused him protocol privileges. The footage went viral. To many Africans, it was not just about one man. It was about dignity. The dignity of refusing to bow. And dignity spread like fire. Social media across the continent lit up with the story. WhatsApp groups buzz with grainy images of Doha's skyline under fire. Television anchors spoke in urgent tones. Ordinary families talked late into the night about sovereignty, about betrayal, about the hope of standing together. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting as a divided collection of states. It was acting as a united front. And yet, beneath the celebrations, fear mingled with pride. Old men remembered the fates of leaders who had dared to defy global powers. Patrice Lumumba, assassinated. Thomas Sankara, gunned down. Muammar Gaddafi, dragged through the dirt. Adama told his grandson that morning, "Be proud your president spoke, but be ready. They killed Lumumba. They killed Sankara. They killed Gaddafi. They may try to kill him, too." Those words captured the heartbeat of Africa's reaction, hope for freedom tempered by the memory of martyrs. Still, for ordinary people there was pride. Finally, their leaders were not bowing their heads. Finally, Africa was not waiting for permission. Finally, the continent was acting on its own terms. This was the main event, a phone call, a sentence, a spark, and suddenly a continent was awake. Now I ask you, do you see Ibrahim Traoré as reckless for challenging Israel, or do you see him as courageous for defending sovereignty? By the second day, the ripples had turned into a wave. Across Africa, governments were not just issuing statements, they were taking action. Burkina Faso suspended military cooperation with Israel, canceled training programs, and ended intelligence sharing agreements. It was a bold step for a small landlocked nation, but Traoré was not backing down. When the Israeli ambassador requested an urgent meeting in Ouagadougou, Traoré's response was sharp. "The only misunderstanding," he said, "is Israel thinking Africa will remain silent when sovereignty is trampled." The words cut deep. For Tel Aviv, this was not only about contracts. It was about the fear of a continent rising in unity. Within 72 hours, 15 African leaders had issued similar condemnations. Ambassadors were recalled from Tel Aviv. South Africa suspended relations. Algeria closed its airspace. Morocco canceled agricultural deals. Nigeria terminated defense contracts. What had once been unimaginable was now reality. Israel, a nation used to near-automatic support from the West, was facing coordinated opposition from Africa. The climax came on the fifth day. The African Union convened an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. Delegates arrived in a flurry, some flying overnight, others driving through dangerous roads just to be present. Inside the marble hall, under the emblem of a golden map of Africa, leaders gathered with anticipation heavy in the air. One by one, they rose to speak. Some recited decades of humiliation, recalling assassinated heroes and broken promises. Others spoke of sovereignty denied, of wars fought on their soil without their consent. And then, Ibrahim Traoré stepped to the podium. The youngest leader in the room, barely past 30, stood in his military fatigues. He looked more like a soldier than a statesman, but perhaps that was why his words carried such weight. He declared, "Africa is no longer the background of other people's wars. From this day, we are the front line of sovereignty." The room erupted, not in polite applause, but in thunderous cheers that echoed through the hall. For the first time in decades, the African Union voted unanimously. They sanctioned Israel. They suspended diplomatic privileges. They demanded accountability at the United Nations. The speed was unprecedented. What normally took months of bureaucracy now happened in hours. For Netanyahu, it was a nightmare. His aides scrambled, calling Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, countries once considered reliable partners, but the calls were ignored. In Accra, the president's office declared simply, "We stand with Africa." In Abuja, Netanyahu's number was blocked. In Nairobi, the Kenyan president listened for less than a minute before handing the phone back to his secretary and walking away. Symbolically, the damage was devastating. Israel had not just lost contracts, it had lost respect. The fallout spread quickly. Defense firms in Tel Aviv saw billions wiped from their balance sheets. Mining deals in West Africa froze. Agricultural projects in North Africa stalled. Investors panicked as stock prices dipped. Analysts admitted on live television, "We underestimated Africa's weight." But the reaction was not just economic or diplomatic. It was deeply personal. In Johannesburg, newspapers ran the headline, "Africa Stands." In Dar es Salaam, children painted Traore's face on school walls. In Bamako, women in the markets spoke of him as "our Sankara reborn." In Cairo, university students compared him to John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. The symbolism was clear. Traore was no longer just the leader of Burkina Faso. He was becoming the symbol of a new Africa. But symbols come with danger. Intelligence briefings in Washington described him as a destabilizing populist. European analysts labeled him a radical nationalist. In Ouagadougou, whispers spread. Will they try to kill him too? Yet the fear only strengthened loyalty. Crowds gathered nightly outside the presidential palace, holding candles, chanting prayers. They were not just protecting a president. They were protecting an idea, that Africa would no longer bow. And the world was watching. Cameras broadcasted the African Union summit, and ordinary people from Cairo to Cape Town felt a sense of pride they had not known in years. For once, they were not bystanders. They were the actors. The climax had arrived. The strike on Qatar was no longer the story. The story was Africa itself. Let me ask you, do you believe Traore's defiance was a turning point for Africa, or will history repeat itself with betrayal and silence? The African Union's decision shook the halls of power in Tel Aviv, Washington, and Paris. But its echo was even louder on the streets of Africa. For ordinary citizens, the crisis was no longer just a headline. It was personal. In Ouagadougou, students gathered at the gates of the university with handwritten signs. Qatar today, Africa tomorrow. In Lagos, taxi drivers tuned their radios to call in shows, demanding their leaders follow Traore's example. In Nairobi, women's groups marched with banners reading, "Sovereignty is sacred." Across the continent, the air was thick with defiance. This was not the kind of protest fueled by foreign aid groups or political parties. It was fueled by memory. Every family carried scars. Some remembered French troops patrolling their towns. Others remembered American drones in their skies. Many remembered dictators kept in power because they served foreign interests. The strike on Qatar was simply the spark that reignited those memories. For the first time in decades, African citizens felt that their leaders were speaking their language. Traore's words on television, "No nation targets another nation's capital and expects African silence," were repeated in mosques, in churches, and in crowded bus stations. The sentence became a chant, and with it came a sense of dignity. But dignity does not pay the bills. Within days, the economic consequences became visible. Israel froze aid programs. Western investors pulled back. Trade contracts were suspended. Prices of fuel and food in parts of the Sahel began to rise. Critics warned that the poorest families would suffer first. International analysts took to television screens. Some dismissed Traore as reckless, saying Burkina Faso risked isolating itself and collapsing economically. Others praised him as a revolutionary, comparing his speeches to those of Thomas Sankara in the 1980s. What none could deny was that he had forced the world to pay attention. And yet, for every analyst warning of collapse, there was an ordinary African who said the sacrifice was worth it. In Bamako, a grandmother told her grandson, "Better hunger with dignity than bread with chains." Her voice echoed the sentiment of millions. Still, shadows loomed. In Ouagadougou, the old miner Adama sat with his grandson one evening. The boy asked if Traore would be safe. Adama sighed and whispered, "They killed Lumumba. They killed Sankara. They killed Gaddafi. They may try to kill him too." His words carried the weight of history, the memory that defiance in Africa often comes with blood. And those fears were not just whispers. Intelligence reports in Europe and the United States speculated openly about threats to Traore's life. The more he became a symbol, the more he became a target. Meanwhile, Africa's internal politics shifted. Parliaments debated canceling contracts. Leaders who once hesitated found themselves under pressure from their citizens. Silence was no longer safe. To ignore the movement was to risk losing legitimacy at home. The civil consequences were powerful, but so were the political ones. Africa's unity was tested almost immediately. Washington and Brussels began to dangle offers, aid packages, investment promises, quiet deals. The temptation to break ranks was strong. History had shown that Africa often fractured under such pressure. Would it happen again? That was the question hanging over the continent. Would leaders stand firm, or would they betray the unity their people were celebrating? For now, the answer was uncertain. But on the streets, the message was clear. Africa was tired of being the backdrop to someone else's war. It was tired of waiting for recognition. It was tired of bowing. The consequences were heavy: economic pain, political risks, and the looming threat of assassination. But the pride outweighed the fear. For once, Africa was leading. Think about this. If dignity comes with sacrifice, would you accept the cost? Or would you bow to the stronger power? In Washington, what first looked like a minor irritation quickly grew into alarm. The National Security Council convened an emergency meeting. Intelligence officials briefed the president, warning, Africa is no longer following. It is leading. The message was blunt. If the continent redirected its resources away from the West, the consequences would reach Detroit, Houston, and Silicon Valley. For decades, America relied on Africa for minerals vital to its industries: cobalt from the Congo, uranium from Niger, rare earth elements from across the Sahel. If African leaders began shifting those resources toward new partners, China, Russia, or even the Middle East, the ripple effects would hit the U.S. economy and its national security. American diplomats scrambled. Phone calls went out to Abuja, Nairobi, and Pretoria. Envoys urged moderation, warning that Africa's strong stance could destabilize global security. But Africans heard a different message. They remembered who destabilized Iraq. They remembered who armed coups during the Cold War. Washington's words carried little moral weight. In Ouagadougou, the American ambassador met with Traore. She insisted his sharp condemnation was undermining dialogue. Traore replied calmly but firmly, Israel's strike destabilized the region. Our response restores balance. If you defend the violator, we will defend the victim. His blunt honesty rattled Washington more than the strike itself. Europe, too, felt the tremors. Paris, long accustomed to shaping Francophone Africa's politics, found its calls ignored. Brussels attempted to mediate but discovered that Africa had no interest in balance when its sovereignty was under fire. London, once an imperial power, could only watch as Africa spoke with a voice that demanded respect. Meanwhile, the Global South celebrated. In Latin America, leaders praised Africa's courage. In Asia, commentators compared Africa's defiance to their own struggles against Western dominance. In the Middle East, Arab nations welcomed Traore with open arms. For the first time, the Arab League invited a young African leader from landlocked Burkina Faso to address its emergency session. When Traore stood before kings and presidents in Cairo, he declared, "Qatar stood with Africa when others turned away. Now Africa stands with Qatar." Sovereignty is not a gift from the powerful. It is the birthright of every nation. His words were broadcast across the Arab world, from Riyadh to Rabat, from Cairo to Casablanca. Millions listened. Many wept. Africa was no longer just a follower in global politics. It was now a leader. And here's the question. Do you believe Washington will accept Africa's new role? Or will it try to crush it before it grows stronger? The smoke over Doha began to clear within a week. But across Africa, the memory of that night refused to fade. For the first time in a generation, the continent had spoken with one voice. And that voice carried weight. Not from Washington, not from Paris, not from Brussels, but from Ouagadougou, a capital many in the West could barely find on a map. The symbolism was unmistakable. Africa, long treated as a backdrop to the dramas of others, had become the protagonist of its own story, and the world, willingly or not, was forced to listen. Yet pride came with danger. History whispered its warning. Patrice Lumumba, assassinated. Thomas Sankara, gunned down. Muammar Gaddafi, dragged through the dirt. Would Ibrahim Traoré share their fate? Would Africa's fragile unity survive the storms of sanctions, intelligence plots, and economic temptations? Those questions hung in the air, unanswered. In Ouagadougou, the old miner Adama sat once more with his grandson. They listened to Traoré's voice crackle over the radio. "When I was your age," Adama said softly, "we whispered the names of Lumumba and Sankara. Today you shout the name of Traoré. Remember this day. History will remember it too." His words captured the shift of generations, from whispered dreams to shouted defiance, from silence to dignity, from endurance to leadership. And so, the world must face a question. Can Africa sustain its courage against overwhelming odds? Can a continent so long dismissed as weak prove that unity, dignity, and sovereignty are the most powerful weapons of all? Or will the old cycle of betrayal return, silencing a movement before it fulfills its promise? That is the cliffhanger, not only for Netanyahu, not only for Washington, but for all of us. Because this story is not just about Africa. It is about every nation, every family, every generation that has asked, will the strong always trample the weak? Or will justice rise? If your heart beats for freedom, if your faith tells you that dignity matters, then reflect on this moment. Share it with your children. Speak it to your community. Let the world see that this is not only a story of presidents and generals, but of people, of families, of faith, and of hope. Africa said enough. Tomorrow that same voice may defend sovereignty wherever it is threatened, even in your own home.